Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here again, sifting through the regs, the research, the white papers, all that dense material to pull out the practical strategies you can actually use. And today, we're really zooming in on you, the FSQA expert, in a large food manufacturing setting. You know, the ones right there on the front lines facing down those audits.
Yeah, we absolutely know that pressure. It's that constant cycle, isn't it? The audit fire drill that seems to come around faster every year.
Exactly.
So our goal today, and this comes straight from the sources we've been digging into, is to help you break that cycle. We're looking for, let's call it a strategic shortcut. How do you turn all that risk intelligence, suppliers, products, how do you turn that into solid, auditable proof? And not just for the audit, but like daily.
That idea of daily readiness, that feels like the big shift. Moving away from that last-minute scramble, especially, I mean, when you look at what's at stake financially, regulators, FDA, USDA, your GFSI auditors, they don't wait around. They want proof, and they want it now. And the sources we looked at, they really hammered this home, that average cost of a food recall. It's a huge number, $10 million.
$10 million. And that's just the average, right? That's the stark reality of not being ready. It covers everything, the investigation, getting rid of the product, the fines.
As a brand image.
And the huge reputational hit, yeah. So what we're focusing on is a framework, really. A system, often tech-enabled, that helps you stay compliant continuously.
Right.
Across all the big ones, FSMA, USDA requirements, and those GFSI schemes like SQF and FSSC.
Right. So this deep dive, it's really about finding that measurable ROI. We want you, the listener, to get past those weeks, buried in binders, pulling all-nighters before an audit.
Yeah, that's just not sustainable.
We're talking about building compliance into the fabric of your operations, making audit readiness just another metric you track, something that's always on, not a 3-week panic attack every 6 months.
Exactly. Survival, yes, but also a measurable return.
Okay, so let's unpack this new reality of audits. If you think back, say, 10 years, things were different, weren't they?
Oh, massively different.
You might have gotten away with, those big 3-ring binders stuffed with certificates, maybe an annual check-in. What are the sources telling us auditors expect now? What are those core pressure points that have really changed the game for FSQA folks?
Well, the biggest change, fundamentally, is the shift from just showing you did something, like here's a certificate, to proving you have a dynamic, ongoing, risk-based system in place.
Okay, so it's not just a piece of paper anymore.
No, not at all. Auditors don't just glance at the document. They dig in. They want to see the data behind the document. They want to understand the system that generated it. They're looking for evidence of continuous control, not just a snapshot in time.
Right.
And the sources are really clear on this. There are basically 4 core types or categories of compliance evidence that are just well, they're non-negotiable. Doesn't matter if it's FDA, USDA, GFSI. If you can't pull these 4 together quickly and convincingly, you're starting off on the back foot immediately.
Okay, let's list them out then. 4 key evidence packages every FSQA expert needs to have essentially on speed dial. Where do we start? Supply chain seems like the big one.
It usually is. So number 1, absolutely critical. Supplier approvals with evidence. This isn't just about having an approved supplier list. This is the core of FSVP, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, right? And it ties directly into FDA 117.4752.
So what does with evidence really mean in practice?
It means you have to show the why. What was the specific risk-based thinking that led you to approve that supplier in the first place? And crucially, what are you doing now? You need to demonstrate ongoing, continuous verification activities. That annual certificate, that's maybe the entry ticket, It's not the proof of control they're looking for. You need to show the data, the history you checked.
Okay, that sounds like a significant step up in complexity right there. Continuous verification is much harder to prove than a one-time check. What's number 2?
Number 2 is the whole world of hazard analyses. This has to cover both the FSMA preventive controls requirements and, the traditional HACCP documentation.
Right. HACCP's been around, but FSMA added layers.
Exactly. Post-FSMA, it's not enough just to list potential hazards. You have to systematically identify and really consider all the known or reasonably foreseeable ones, biological, chemical, physical, all of them. And the level of data you need now to justify why you decided a hazard isn't likely or why your control is good enough. It's much, much higher. Auditors will challenge your assumptions if you don't have the data to back them up.
Okay, supplier approval, hazard analysis, what's the third area? You mentioned something earlier about economic factors.
Yeah, that's number 3, and it's become a really big focus lately. Fraud vulnerability assessments. This is a specific requirement now in major GFSI schemes, especially SQF and FSSC. Auditors expect to see solid data-driven evidence that you've looked at your supply chain and figured out where it's vulnerable to economic adulteration.
So moving beyond just safety into deliberate deception, basically.
Precisely. It's a different type of risk, requires a different type of thinking, and crucially different evidence.
And the final piece, the one you hope you never need but have to be ready for.
That's number 4, recall documentation. And this needs to be tightly aligned with the regs like FDA 117.139 or the USDA FSIS rules. Yes, auditors want to see a documented recall plan. That's table stakes. But what they really scrutinize now is the evidence of your monitoring. Are you continuously tracking external incidents, other recalls, alerts, warnings that could impact your products or ingredients? They want proof you're vigilant, that you see the signs before something happens internally.
That vigilance piece seems key across all 4 areas. And it's quite sobering when the sources talk about the cost of not having this daily readiness. They literally say companies scramble in binders, waste weeks preparing, and sometimes fail audits.
Yeah.
That's just wasted effort, isn't it? Time that FSQA teams could be using for, actual improvement, not just chasing paper.
It's worse than wasted effort. It's inefficiency piled on top of significant risk. And that's why that initial ROI data we talked about is so critical. It helps justify investing in a better way.
Right, the $10 million recall figure.
Exactly. A proactive, data-driven system is your best defense against that massive potential cost. But it's not just about avoiding disaster. The sources cite actual client data showing that companies using these approaches can cut their audit prep time by 50%.
50%?
Wow, 50%.
That's huge.
Think about it. Taking weeks of manual drudgery, digging through files, compiling reports, and shrinking that down to maybe just a few days of generating the right evidence packs from a system, that's a massive operational saving. Frees up your experts to do more valuable work.
Okay, but let me just play devil's advocate for a second here. If an auditor comes in and you show them a slick report generated in minutes and you say, hey, this saved us 50% of our prep time, aren't they going to be a bit skeptical? Like, where's the human element? Where's the deep thinking about this specific supplier? How do the sources address that potential pushback?
That's a really important question. And yeah, you have to address it head on. The key is transparency. The system doesn't replace the diligence. It just automates gathering and presenting the evidence of that diligence. So the auditor isn't just getting a summary report. They're getting something that's essentially a live index, linked directly back to the source data. They can see the specific border rejection you referenced, the actual FDA warning letter text, the methodology used for the risk score. The 50% time saving comes from cutting out the manual grunt work, the copying, the pasting, the spreadsheet nightmares, not from skipping the actual verification or analysis.
Well, the evidence is just better organized, more complete.
Exactly. It's consolidated, it's complete, it's traceable, and frankly, it's much harder to argue with than a stack of binders. The diligence is still there. It's just proven more efficiently.
Okay, let's spend some quality time on the supply chain now, because you're right, that continuous monitoring piece feels like the heaviest lift for many FSQA teams. The auditor walks in and that question always comes up. How do you monitor your suppliers continuously? And the old answer, we visit them every 3 years. That just doesn't cut it anymore, especially under FSVP, right?
No, definitely not. That traditional periodic check-in, it creates this huge pain point, especially for larger manufacturers. I mean, the profile cited in our source material is pretty typical, a company with over 1,100 suppliers.
Wow, 1,100.
Yeah. And maybe 500 plus different materials, ingredients coming in. Now imagine trying to manually keep track of risks associated with all of those. Scanning the web, checking regulatory sites, reading news feeds. It's physically impossible for an FSQA team, no matter how big they are.
So they're always kind of operating with this background fear that something important might slip through the cracks.
Absolutely. There's this constant anxiety about missing a critical risk, something brewing out there in the supply chain that could cause a major problem downstream.
So if manual monitoring is basically impossible at scale, what does this real-time global incident data actually consist of? Where does it come from? And how does it magically turn into audit-ready evidence?
All right, let's get into the nuts and bolts a bit. This isn't magic. It's data aggregation and normalization happening constantly. We're talking about pulling data from hundreds of different places. Official sources like the EU's RASFF system, that's the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed.
Okay.
The FDA Import Alert List, their enforcement report database, USDA FSIS enforcement notices, Plus, global media monitoring, sometimes even proprietary lab testing data that gets aggregated across the industry anonymously. It's a huge amount of raw information.
So the key is bringing it all together in one place. So the FSQA person doesn't have to visit like 20 different government websites every morning.
Precisely. That's the first step, aggregation. But the real power comes in the next step. Filtering and matching that global data specifically to your approved suppliers and the ingredients you actually buy.
Making it relevant.
Exactly. That's when this flood of data turns into actionable alerts and becomes that audit-ready supplier monitoring evidence. Because for FSVP, thinking about the specific regulations like 21 USC 350, the auditor needs proof your verification isn't static. It's ongoing. You have to show you're checking daily or near daily for things like new import refusals involving your supplier, new import alerts on their products, recalls they might be involved in, failed inspections, any relevant FDA actions.
So continuous monitoring basically means proving you have your finger on the pulse of your supplier's regulatory standing all the time. Can you give us a concrete example? How does this work in practice for a manufacturer?
Yeah, absolutely. The sources mentioned a really good case study, a large bakery manufacturer. They were using one of these dynamic monitoring systems. They got an early specific alert about an ingredient they used. It flagged a salmonella issue that had popped up overseas in the supply chain for that particular material group.
Okay, so not necessarily their direct supplier, but related.
Could be the supplier, could be the region, could be the material type. The system flagged it as a high potential risk for them because they got that instant traceable alert. They didn't wait. They immediately triggered a targeted surveillance audit of their specific supplier for that ingredient.
Proactive, not reactive.
Exactly. And crucially, they stopped that specific ingredient lot from even entering their production facility. They potentially avoided a huge internal contamination event, maybe even a massive recall. And that whole sequence, the alert, the risk assessment, the audit trigger, the product hold, that's the documented proactive compliance evidence the auditor can see, trace, and verify. It proves the system works.
That's powerful, showing you caught something based on external data before it became your problem. That's undeniable proof of a working FSVP system. It's not just ticking a box, it's literally protecting the business.
And that leads us perfectly into the second use case here, which is risk-based due diligence. So, where use case 1, the alerts, handles the immediate ongoing threats, use case 2, due diligence, uses all that historical data plus the current alerts to build a really solid, justifiable, risk-based approach to qualifying and requalifying suppliers.
And the pain point here, according to the sources, is pretty stark. Teams get bogged down doing this manually, right? Using these giant spreadsheets, trying to track everything.
And on the spreadsheet nightmare, yeah. Thousands of rows, trying to manually collate data from different places, maybe only updating it once a year. It's slow, it's prone to errors, and fundamentally, it's often not truly risk-based. It might be based on volume or just history, but not necessarily on objective current risk data. And that's exactly what regulators like the FDA are pushing everyone away from.
So what's the alternative? How do you create that structured supplier dossier you mentioned earlier?
The solution is really about aggregating all that relevant external data. The stuff we talked about, recalls, border rejections, inspection results, warning letters, and pulling it together automatically into a single, structured profile for each supplier. This dossier becomes like the auditor's best friend.
Because everything's in one place.
Everything's in one place, and importantly, the raw data is translated into an objective, calculated risk score. This profile doesn't just list incidents. It shows the supplier's overall compliance history and quantifies their current risk level based on weighted factors.
Okay, calculated risk score. That sounds good, but how do you make sure that score is actually meaningful and crucially defensible to an auditor? It can't just be arbitrary.
Absolutely not. That's where the data weighting logic comes in. It's not just counting incidents. A really serious event, like, say, an FDA warning letter that cites major sanitation problems or a complete breakdown in their HACCP plan, that gets weighted much, much higher than maybe a single minor border rejection for a labeling error.
So severity matters.
Severity, frequency, recency, all factored in. The system applies specific risk weights, often derived directly from regulatory priorities and potential public health impact. So maybe your recent recall for an undeclared allergen gets 90 points, while that minor documentation issue gets 10 points. You add it all up, and the total score gives you a clear, data-driven indication of that supplier's risk level right now.
And that score then dictates the verification needed.
Precisely. This ties directly back to the FSVP requirements. Remember, the rule says Importers must perform risk-based foreign supplier verification. So if this data-driven risk score comes back high, well, that justifies, even mandates, a higher intensity verification activity. Maybe it's an on-site audit. Maybe it's increased product testing.
And if the score is low?
If the score is low and is backed up by consistently clean data over time, you might be able to justify a less resource-intensive approach, like a thorough documentation review, instead of flying someone across the world. It makes your compliance decisions rational, transparent, and evidence-based.
Which brings us back to that ROI point, saving actual money.
Yes. And that quote we mentioned earlier from the VP at the seafood company, it's such a perfect illustration. They used this kind of aggregated risk assessment. It showed a particular overseas supplier wasn't as high risk as they might have assumed based on old information. They avoided one unnecessary audit trip.
Which saved them. What was it?
Between $15,000 and $30,000 for one trip.
$15,000 to $30,000 just for avoiding one trip. That's a number that gets attention, especially if you're an FSQA manager trying to justify investing in a better system to your finance department. It's not just travel costs either, right? It's staff time, opportunity cost.
Exactly. It proves that doing the risk assessment properly up front, using comprehensive data, prevents wasting precious resources.
Yeah.
FSQA teams always have tight budgets for travel and limited time for their experts. This ensures that when they do spend that $30,000 and dedicate 2 weeks of someone's time to fly halfway around the world, it's because the data proves that supplier genuinely warrants that level of scrutiny.
So it changes the audit decision from maybe a gut feeling or just following a schedule to a calculated, financially sound decision backed by solid evidence.
And that's the goal. Transforming FSQA from purely a cost center into a strategic risk management function with demonstrable ROI.
Okay, so we've really covered how this continuous data approach revolutionizes managing external supplier risk. Now let's pivot and bring that same data-driven lens inside the manufacturing plant. Let's talk about hazard analysis. You mentioned earlier this is often the most technically demanding piece for FSQA teams, especially under FSMA.
Yeah, the real pain point here often comes down to reliability and just scale.
Yeah.
How does an FSQA team, which might be quite small even in a large company, get a truly comprehensive, reliable picture of all the potential hazards that could affect their specific ingredients, especially new or emerging hazards they might not have seen before?
Right. Trying to manually research thousands of different materials against global reports, scientific literature, it's just not practical.
It's not scalable, and it's not reliable. There's always that nagging worry. Did we miss something? Is there a new chemical risk out there the auditor knows about, but we don't?
And the regulators aren't flexible on this. We're talking the FDA's Preventive Controls Rule, Part 117. It's very clear. You must identify and consider those known or reasonably foreseeable hazards, biological, chemical, physical. And if a hazard needs a preventive control, you have to have it, document it, implement it, verify it, the whole loop.
Absolutely. So this is where leveraging that same stream of dynamic global incident data becomes crucial for generating audit-ready hazard reports. Instead of just relying on generic textbooks or old internal data, you can use analytics dashboards. These tools can look at actual global incidents related to your ingredients or ingredient categories.
How does that look? What does the dashboard show?
It can break it down, show you the percentage of incidents globally that are chemical versus biological versus physical or allergenic. It can rank the specific hazards by frequency for your types of materials. This gives you immediate, justifiable evidence to determine which hazards are truly reasonably foreseeable for you, based on what's actually happening out there in the real world.
That statistical breakdown you mentioned earlier was really interesting. The sources highlighted that chemical incidents were responsible for something like over 62% of reported issues globally. That seems surprisingly high.
It often surprises people. The traditional focus in HACCP was very heavily weighted towards biological pathogens, salmonellas, listeria, E. coli, and maybe physical hazards like metal or glass. And those are still absolutely critical, don't get me wrong.
Of course.
But the data is showing that chemical risks, things like pesticide residues, unapproved additives, cleaning chemical residues, even undeclared allergens resulting from cross-contact, which often gets classified chemically, these are becoming increasingly complex and frequent.
So what does that 62% figure tell an FSQA expert about where to focus their resources?
It signals a need for maybe a shift in emphasis. It means your preventive controls related to chemical management, things like robust supplier testing protocols for specific residues, strict chemical storage procedures, thorough cleaning validation, rigorous allergen control programs. These need to be really buttoned down, and you need the data, like that 62% trend, to justify that focus to auditors.
Can we make this more concrete? Let's take a specific product example, like you mentioned earlier, a sesame bar. How does this hazard data become specific and actionable for that product?
Okay, great example. If you query a system like this for hazards related to sesame seeds or maybe tahini paste, it won't just give you a generic list like pathogens. It will get specific. It might flag salmonella as a top biological risk based on recent global incidents involving sesame. It might also highlight specific pathogenic E. coli strains sometimes found. But then critically, it will also pull in the relevant chemical hazards frequently associated with sesame, depending on sourcing, maybe specific pesticides known to be used in certain growing regions, or perhaps risks related to heavy metals, or even ethylene oxide, which has been a big issue.
So it's tailored.
Highly tailored. And generating that specific evidence-backed hazard analysis report, which you can potentially do in minutes, demonstrates to an auditor that you haven't just copied a generic template. You've done a deep dive, consider the actual current risks relevant to your specific inputs based on global data. That builds confidence.
Okay, that makes sense for unintentional hazards. Now let's shift gears slightly to those intentional risks, food fraud and adulteration. You said this is a big focus for GFSI auditors now.
Yeah, it's definitely moves from a nice-to-have to a core compliance requirement. For schemes like SQF or FSSC, auditors are now specifically looking for a robust vulnerability assessment, and they don't just want to see that you did one. They want to see it's based on current information and supported by global data trends. The sources also emphasize that economic adulteration, substituting something cheaper for a valuable ingredient, that has to be explicitly considered within your overall preventive controls plan now, too.
And there's a regulatory hook for this as well, right, under FSMA?
Yes, the FSMA rule on intentional adulteration, the food defense rule, requires companies to identify the vulnerable points in their processes, specifically to prevent wide-scale public health harm. While that rule is more focused on acts intended to cause harm, the vulnerability assessment mindset requires definitely overlaps with assessing vulnerability to economic adulteration, which needs to be addressed under the preventive controls rules hazard analysis if it could impact safety, like undeclared allergens in a substituted ingredient.
Okay, so how do teams generate the evidence for this if it needs to be current and data-driven?
This is where leveraging that continuous global data feed really shines again, especially looking at trends. To satisfy auditors, particularly for GFSI, FSQA teams need to move beyond a static assessment. The best practice emerging is creating regular, say, monthly food fraud and vulnerability assessment reports.
Monthly, okay.
Yeah, and these reports shouldn't just look backward. The real power comes when they include actual forecasts of incident trends. Using historical data and modeling, they can show predicted versus actual incident levels for certain commodities or frog types over the next month, 3 months, even 12 months.
Wow, forecasting fraud. That sounds advanced. How does that help?
It helps you anticipate risk. If the forecast shows a likely spike in, say, olive oil adulteration due to a poor harvest driving up prices, you can proactively increase testing on incoming olive oil shipments before the predicted spike hits. That's the kind of proactive management auditors love to see. It moves you way beyond just reacting to past incidents.
And the sources gave some pretty startling examples of recent fraud spikes.
They did. And they really highlight how economic pressures can drive this. Fish and fish products, a shocking 433% increase in reported fraud incidents in the period studied. Often things like species substitution, selling cheaper fish as cod or snapper, or mislabeling farmed fish as wild caught.
433%. Why so high there?
Complex global supply chains, high price points for popular species, difficulty in verifying origin. It creates a perfect storm for fraud. Then you had fruit and vegetable juices up 400%, often dilution with water or cheaper fruit juices, or undeclared sweeteners. And cocoa, coffee, tea preparations up 390%, sometimes using fillers like chicory in coffee or undeclared starches in cocoa powder.
What's the takeaway for, say, a dairy company looking at this? Maybe they use cocoa or fruit preps.
The takeaway is that they need to be actively monitoring these trends. If they use cocoa, that 390% spike is a direct alert. They can take those monthly fraud trend reports, showing they're aware of the heightened risk for cocoa, and include that right in their SQF audit evidence package. It justifies any increased supplier scrutiny or testing they've implemented. It proves their vulnerability assessment isn't just a document sitting on a shelf. It's a live process informed by current global intelligence.
Let's drill down a bit more into the practical application of this data within the traditional HACCP plan itself. Smaller teams often struggle with this. How do you avoid just creating a generic list of every possible hazard under the sun and instead really focus, like the regulators want, only on those hazards that are truly reasonably likely to occur in your specific facility with your specific ingredients? How does using global incident data help bridge that gap? Hashtag tag 4.1 HACCP hotspot identification.
Yeah, that's a classic HACCP challenge. And global incident data provides the crucial piece that's often missing: objective likelihood evidence. It moves the discussion in the HACCP team meeting away from just brainstorming or relying solely on past internal experience, which might be limited.
So instead of just guessing or using old textbooks.
Exactly. You can use the data to instantly generate prioritized hazard lists. You could even create visual hotspot maps for your HACCP plan, showing which categories biological, chemical, physical, allergen are currently trending high for your specific ingredient groups based on documented global frequency. It gives you a rational starting point.
Okay, so let's walk through how this data actually weaves into the traditional HACCP steps. Say, step 1, conduct a hazard analysis identifying the hazards. How does the data change that first step?
It makes it data-driven from the outset. Instead of just listing salmonella as a hazard for, say, herbs and spices because the book says so, you can pull up the actual incident data. The system might show, for example, that over the last 12 months globally, there were 176 recorded incidents involving salmonella in herbs and spices.
Okay.
But maybe there are also 110 incidents involving the pesticide chlorpyrifos in that same category, and 93 involving ethylene oxide contamination. Now, you have a quantified basis for ranking these hazards. Salmonella is clearly number 1, but chlorpyrifos and ETO are significant and also reasonably foreseeable based on this real-world frequency data.
So you can objectively justify why you're focusing on those specific hazards in your plan.
Precisely. It provides that auditable justification for deeming them reasonably likely to occur for that specific ingredient category. It shifts the conversation from subjective opinion to objective evidence right from step 1.
Okay, that makes sense for identifying and prioritizing. But what about later steps, like step 3, establishing critical limits? That usually relies heavily on internal validation studies, right? Your own process parameters, your own testing results. How does external data feed into setting a specific number, like a temperature or a ppm level?
That's where you see the synthesis of external and internal data. The external incident data often establishes the why and the what why is this hazard important to control, because it's happening frequently globally, and what specific variant or chemical should we focus on. Then your internal data, your validation studies, your historical testing results informs the how much.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's go back to pesticides in produce, like lettuce. The external data might show a high frequency of incidents globally involving the pesticide acephate on leafy greens. That establishes the likelihood and the necessity of having a preventive control for acephate.
Okay, so the external data says worry about acephate.
Right. Then you look at your internal system. Maybe you have data from your supplier testing program or historical residue tests you've run. The system can integrate that. Based on your validated testing methods and maybe regulatory limits, you establish your specific critical limit for acephate at, say, 0.002 parts per million.
Ah, I see. So the external data justifies why you're testing for acephate specifically, and your internal data and standards define the acceptable level.
Exactly. And when you present that to an auditor, it's incredibly powerful. You're showing them your FISA. Critical limit isn't just some number you pulled out of thin air or copied from a generic guide. It's a data-validated limit, informed by both the global threat landscape, frequency, severity of acephate issues, and your own specific process capabilities and verification results, your 0002 ppm measurement. It demonstrates a much more sophisticated, evidence-driven approach to control, which auditors tend to trust much more readily.
Okay, that clarifies the HACCP link. Now, shifting to the crisis end of things, recall readiness. You called this the hot button issue. The requirement isn't just having a plan, but proving you're actively monitoring the triggers. Hashtag tag 4.2, recall readiness and traceability.
Yes, absolutely. The mandate from both FBA under 117.139 and USDA FSIS is crystal clear. You need your documented recall plan, yes, but you also need readily available evidence that you are actively monitoring for information that could necessitate a recall. When something goes wrong, the clock is ticking incredibly fast. Auditors need to see proof that you were already plugged into relevant risk information before they even ask the question during an investigation or a routine check.
So what does that proof of monitoring look like in practice? What's the compliance output? You mentioned recall evidence packs.
Right. The idea is that the system can, on demand, generate these consolidated reports or evidence packs. These aren't just lists of alerts. They provide a structured, chronological, and auditable view of every significant external incident that was relevant to your specific brands, your suppliers, and your ingredients over a defined period.
What kind of detail is in there?
It should meticulously break down each relevant incident. What was the hazard type, chemical, physical, biological, allergen? What was this specific hazard, plastic fragment, undeclared milk, Listeria monocytogenes? Which ingredients or product types were affected? Where did it happen? This creates a traceable log of your awareness.
It sounds like this would also be incredibly useful during an actual internal investigation, not just for the auditor.
Oh, immensely useful. Instead of scrambling to figure out, have we seen issues with this supplier or ingredient before? You have an immediate aggregated timeline right there. When the auditor asks, okay, you had a metal fragment issue with ingredient X. How are you monitoring that risk beforehand? You can instantly provide a report showing every global incident involving metal fragments related to that ingredient category that the system flagged for you over the past 6 months or a year or whatever time frame is relevant.
That sounds like powerful proof of vigilance.
It is. And beyond just proving monitoring for the auditor, the sources suggest that having this integrated data readily available can significantly speed up an actual internal recall investigation. They estimate it can shorten the investigation and communication phase by up to 2 days.
2 whole days? In a recall situation, that's huge.
It's absolutely critical. Those 48 hours can make a massive difference in identifying the scope, containing the product, notifying regulators and customers, minimizing public health impact, reducing the amount of product destroyed, and ultimately protecting the brand's reputation. That time saving alone can translate into millions of dollars saved during a crisis.
Okay, this has been incredibly detailed. We've walked through how this continuous intelligence approach transforms supplier management, hazard analysis, fraud assessment, HACCP, and recall readiness. Let's tie it all together now and bring it back to that crucial point, the business value. How do we quantify the return on investment for the FSQA team and really for the entire organization?
Right, because at the end of the day, FSQA leaders need to make a compelling business case for investing in these kinds of systems and processes. The measurable outcomes, drawn from the sources, are pretty clear and fall into a few key buckets.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, sheer productivity gains for the FSQA team itself. We talked about that 50% reduction in effort spent just manually checking sources and identifying potential hazards. That's half the time spent on that task, freed up immediately.
50% on hazard identification.
And then similarly, another 50% reduction in effort estimated for the manual reporting side. Compiling the data, formatting it, generating all the reports needed just to satisfy the documentation requirements for FSMA rules and those annual GFSI audits. Put those together, and you're potentially doubling the capacity of your existing team to focus on higher value activities without adding headcount.
That's significant. Time recovered is essentially resource gained.
Exactly. But the biggest value proposition, arguably, remains incident prevention. By having that real-time intelligence, by seeing emerging risks sooner, you can activate preventive measures earlier. You might change a supplier, increase testing, adjust a process, and by doing that, you avoid those incredibly costly incidents, the recalls that average $10 million. It's classic risk mitigation, investing a smaller amount proactively to prevent a potentially catastrophic loss.
Makes sense. Prevent the fire instead of just getting better at putting it out.
Precisely. And even when a crisis does occur, because no system is perfect, that speed factor comes into play again. Shortening the recall investigation by up to 2 days, as we discussed, that speed translates directly into cost savings, less product lost, faster market recovery, reduced litigation risk, less long-term brand damage. Speed is money in a recall.
Absolutely. And let's just quickly revisit that specific cost avoidance example, the seafood company, because it really drives home the financial control aspect.
Yeah, it's worth repeating. Avoiding that one single unnecessary international audit trip saved them between $15,000 and $30,000. That's not some fuzzy theoretical saving. That's hard dollars kept in the company's bank account. It demonstrates perfectly how using data for upfront risk assessment ensures that significant resources, like expensive international travel and expert time, are only deployed where the actual data shows the risk warrants that level of investment.
It really reframes the FSQA role, doesn't it? From being seen primarily as a compliance cost center, focused on paperwork and audits,
to becoming a strategic risk intelligence hub, using data to actively protect the business and demonstrating clear financial contribution. That's a fundamental shift. Tag outro.
Well, I've certainly taken a deep dive today into how you can transform that constant flow of risk intelligence into solid, undeniable evidence for auditors. We've really unpacked those 4 key pillars they demand: that proactive, continuous supplier monitoring,
The detailed risk-based due diligence using objective scoring,
your data-driven hazard analysis for HACCP and preventive controls.
and that continuous fraud vulnerability assessment informed by global trends.
The central message, really, for all you FSQA leaders and professionals listening, especially in those complex manufacturing environments, is that the game has changed. The expectation now is for proactive, daily evidence generation. Leveraging global data isn't just a nice-to-have, it's becoming the standard for demonstrating continuous control.
Yeah, the goal really needs to be shifting. Audit readiness shouldn't feel like a 3-week scramble every few months. It should be a status you can basically confirm on your dashboard every single morning, knowing you're prepared because the evidence is being generated continuously.
And that brings us nicely to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. We've established, based on the sources, that these integrated data and monitoring systems can potentially free up 50% of the time your team currently sinks into manual audit prep and hazard checking. So the question is, if that compliance evidence generation becomes largely automated, what should you do with all that newly freed up expert time?
Interesting question.
What new high-value risk mitigation strategies could you pursue? Should you be investing more heavily in supplier development programs, focusing on optimizing sanitation controls even further, maybe embedding this risk intelligence earlier, directly into your R&D and product formulation process? It's a chance to think beyond just ticking the compliance boxes and really strategize about how to best safeguard your brand and your supply chain for the future.
A lot to think about there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.